Okay, so since decade wrap-ups, are a very big thing right now, I thought that I'd just take this time to just talk about all the books that I've written over the past decade. Now, when I say written, I don't mean as in I started writing them or that I even finished the rough draft of them. I mean that I've published. So since I only became a published author or an indie author in 2018, this video is going to be considerably longer than any of the other ones I do that will be in this series called Decade Wrap-Up, because this is the first one. Because I've only really been published for a little over a year now. But basically how this works is I talk about the books, I explain them, I explain the writing process I had behind them, I explain why I wrote them, what made me decide I wanted to write them, and then I rank them at the end. Alright, so I'm going to take you all the way back to October 2018. Remember that? Yeah, that seems like a fucking age ago, doesn't it? But it wasn't. So, first thing I wrote was Riviere. This first book I've ever published. And actually, fun fact, this is probably the biggest deviation I have ever done in terms of writing. Because most of the time I write fantasy or science fiction, and I'd never really delved into crime thrillers before. But that's not the only reason. It's one of the stranger books that I've written, or not really something that I would generally have even considered I'd write when I started writing in 2013. It's also told from the perspective of women, which was really difficult for me to do, because as you can quite clearly see from my picture right on the screen right now, I am a man. And writing from the perspective of women actually gave me a lot of insight. But enough about that, let's get into the story. So the story of this is basically that two women who live in opposite buildings gloom into each other's lives. One of them is lonely. She's alone, she has nobody, and she's a private investigator. The other is a former hacker who she used to be a hacker but has since quit that to marry her husband, who is being abusive. So the whole plot of this is about murder, the murder of the husband. Now, of course, when I say this, I'm not saying that you should kill people who are abusive. I'm not saying that at all. But I did that for an interesting narrative. And I really love this book. This is probably one of my favorite things I've ever written in my life. Honestly, I might even prefer it to the other two books that I'm about to show you. But I didn't really plan much of this. To be honest, with this book, I only planned the concept of two women living in opposite sides of the buildings, thinking each other's lives are perfect, then realizing they're not. I did the whole grass is always green on the other side thing. But I didn't go further than that. I didn't really look at it and go, well, David's going to have an abusive husband, and we're going to kill him. I didn't do that, but we're going to try and kill him. Whether or not he actually dies, you'll have to read the book to find out. And this is also spawning a trilogy that I'm doing. I haven't written book 2 yet, or book 3, but I have plans for them, and book 2 will be released in 2020. Hopefully. Okay, so that's Ruby writing. Okay, and the second book that I wrote, all the way back in August of 2019, I know, such a long time ago, really going far back for these, is Thanatos, an Anthology. Now this is a collection of short stories about characters and people who have suicidal thoughts. And the idea behind me writing this was very personal. I'm not going to go too much into it, but you can probably figure out that I at some point wanted to kill myself, so I'm not going to go too deep into that because I figure that's something for another video if I ever want to talk about it, or maybe I just won't ever talk about it because it's not really anybody's business and I don't really want to, and the final short story in this is my own personal experience anyway, so I figure I don't really need to. But the idea of this was that all people get depressed. All people want to kill themselves at some point. Not all people in general, but like anybody. It could happen to anyone. And that was the point of this. This is meant to make people feel like oh, maybe that person who seemed a little bit off yesterday, maybe I should check in on them. And also another thing about this is that all the proceeds that I make for this go to Mind, the mental health charity in the UK that helps people with suicidal tendencies and other mental health problems. Now I did my first donation to this a few days ago because I finally got the royalties in, and I'm hoping that more people buy this so I can donate more. Okay, so now we move on to the final thing that I've done this decade, and that is Buried. Now this fucking thing. I love this thing. This is about vampires basically, which is something I've always been very interested in. I've always really liked the concept of vampires and the idea of them, but I did do the thing of not making them seem goth. Because I feel like a lot of writers, when they write about vampires, they like to make them seem really goth, and I never really understood that, because yes, goth comes from gothic, but Dracula wasn't crying about how much of a sad boy he was. He wasn't doing that. He was going around killing people. It's not so much about that in general, though. It's more about... This is actually very inspired by true events. This is loosely based on just racism and prejudice in general. And the reason I thought of releasing this is because of our current political climate. I don't really want to talk about politics, but I will. And this is about an ordinary man who basically only just becomes a vampire, and he's thrown into a world where this underground society of vampires, werewolves, ghosts, zombies, skeletons, and they all have their own distinctive roles for species. So vampires are hunters, they kill people for money, and assassins. Ghosts are doctors, because their Hippocratic oath is what binds them. Werewolves are diplomats, because they're the most human-like, and so they get money and food into the undead bunkers. And zombies are military. And the idea behind this is that people don't know these undead exist. But then they do. Then it's about how we navigate this. And I really love this. As I said, I only wrote it recently. Like, I was working on writing this only this year. But I love it the same. Okay, so now I've done a very basic wrap up of these. I am going to rank them. So, at number 3, but by no means my least favourite thing I've ever written, is Thanatos. Now, I love this anthology. It comes from a very personal place, but for me, it doesn't hold as much water or as much weight to me as the other two, because they're just short stories. I've never really tried short stories before, but truth be told, I've always been a novella kind of person. But I do quite like that I did this, and I do quite like what it represents. Alright, at second place we have the first thing I ever released, Riviere. Now, while this has spawned a trilogy of such, and an entire shared universe, this is the first book in the very shared universe, I am unbelievably surprised at how long it took me to actually get this done. Like, while I initially published it in October 2018, this version, I don't think, with this version in particular, but the final version, I don't think has come out until maybe June 2019, because I realized I made a bunch of spelling errors, there were a bunch of inconsistencies, so I changed them, because I kind of rushed with writing this and releasing it, because I really wanted the title of a published author. So yeah, that's why it's number 2. And the favourite book I've written this decade is Buried. Now, it's not really much of a surprise, it's the most recent one, it's the one I've written most recently, so it should be. It should absolutely be my favourite. And while I think that Riviere did introduce the shared universe, I feel like this one really expands upon it. Like, Riviere is very much a character study of two characters. It doesn't really delve into the world outside very much. In fact, someone who's reviewed it has actually pointed this out, and while I don't agree with everything this reviewer said, I do agree with that specific comment they made. But Buried opened the world out instead of it just being the Dark City of Utopia, we have Altitude City. We have an underground bunker of undead people. We have mentions of other cities. We have a whole network of these people who work with the undead. It really opens up the world and creates this noir setting that I really love. Obviously, I'm not going to rate it. So yeah, that was my decade wrap up. It's kind of short, but it's 10 minutes long now. Jesus, I was expecting this to be a lot shorter, but I guess I just got kind of into it. But the next time I do this decade wrap up, I will probably have written maybe 8 or 9 books in 2020. In the 2020s, so that video might end up being an hour long. So everybody, write on, and I'll see you in the next decade.